The date is June 17th, 1999. The interviewee is Mrs. Belzec, née Mayer. The interviewer is Kenneth Aran. It will take place in Suffern, New York, in the United States, and it will be conducted in English. The date is June 17th, 1999. The interviewee is Mrs. Belzec, née Mayer. The interview will be conducted by Kenneth Aran. It will be held in Suffern, New York, in the United States, and it will be conducted in English. Good morning.
Good morning.
Would you please state and spell your name for us?
Bell, B-E-L-L-E, Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R, Zek, Z-E-C-K.
And what was your date of birth?
February 22nd, 1919.
And in what city and country were you born?
Port Henry, New York. The United States, of course.
Mm-hmm. And what were the names of your parents?
My mother's name was Gussie Weiss Mayer, Weiss, her maiden name. My father's name was Gustav Mayer.
And did you have any brothers or sisters?
Yes, 2 older brothers and an older sister. The oldest, Sydney, is still alive at the age of 90. And then there was my brother Henry Mayer and my sister Helena Mayer Kalmus, who did a one-woman relief organization after the war. She was kind of a one-woman UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Agency, largely here in the county for the displaced persons.
And what was your father's occupation?
My father was a farmer in upstate New York, but he could not make a living at dairy farming, and he always had to go into business to support his family, which is the reason we moved to Suffern from upstate. And but as soon as he got a few dollars, he would buy another farm, you know, usually on credit and a prayer.
Did your mother help him with the farm work?
No, no, she didn't milk cows, but she worked very, very hard, particularly up in Mariah or Port Henry, because there was no plumbing and there were farm hands who had to be fed, and she was doing laundry and cooking from early morning to late at night. It was a terribly hard life. Of course, it improved when we came to Suffern in 1925 in the sense that you had running water and electricity. But it's hard to really remember how primitive things were at the time I was born.
So how old were you then when you moved to Suffern?
6.
Mm-hmm.
I was 6.
Do you remember much of your personal life on the farm?
Very little. And it's very hard for me to distinguish what I have, stories I've heard from others, from what I remember. I do remember going to school at the age of 4, to a one-room schoolhouse in Crown Point. That was because my siblings were at that school, and the teacher who taught all the grades used to stop at our farm on her way to the school in Crown Point for a cup of tea in the wintertime, something hot. And I was so lonely when my siblings left for school, and I would cry and beg to, and so she said to my mother, I'll take her. And so she took me for what you might say was kindergarten, and I guess the first grade, because when I came to Suffern, I was skipped to the 3rd grade, which made for my graduating from high school at a comparatively young age and graduating from law school at a comparatively young age.
Did you have any family relations who lived anywhere near Port Henry when you lived there?
Yes. My uncle, Emmanuel Weiss, who was the Coca-Cola bottler in Port Henry for something like 50 years or so, and over 50, and he also was on the Port Henry High School Board of Education, which was important in the sense that he kept my brother Sidney, who was rather wild, who became a lawyer eventually, but who was rather wild in high school. He managed, his influence kept Sidney in school.
Mm-hmm. When you moved from Port Henry and you came to Suffern with all the miracles of the running water, you said before that your father also attempted to buy farms when he had a chance.
Oh, yes.
Was he a farmer here in Suffern too?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Was it also a dairy farm?
Also a dairy farm.
And how long did he have that farm?
Until he died. And then my brother Henry kept it going for a few years after the war. My father died in June of 1945, at a time that I was in London trying to get back for his funeral. And I think when the Thruway, shortly before the New York State Thruway was built, it came right through the middle of the farm. And shortly before then, maybe a year or so, when we were advised of the taking, my brother Henry got rid of the cows.
When you moved here, you alluded to the fact that you had graduated early from high school. How would you describe the kind of educational experiences that you had in high school here in Suffern?
They were superb. I never realized until, maybe 30, 40 years ago, when my own children went to school, that how elitist a school it was. For example, 2 years of Latin were required of every student. Most of the students graduated with college entrance diplomas, which meant that they had to take regents in various subjects. I'm talking about the ordinary graduate had a minimum of 2 years of Latin, 3 years of either French or German, required general science, required biology, and some no-nonsense mathematics. As I say, it was really for anyone who had the slightest interest in history, or in the humanities, it was really a very unusual school, which of course you don't realize at the time, you know. It was also a very repressive school. I mean, we published a newspaper, I recall, and the principal had a heart attack over it because it had a gossip column in it. A very mild, innocuous kind of thing, and he just banned it, and then we published it again, and actually I was suspended, and this was my senior year. But it was just suspension of a few days. So that was high school.
Did you have any religious upbringing in your home?
Yes. When I was, at the time my brothers were being bar mitzvahed, there were no Jews in Port Henry or Moriah, and except for my uncle and his family. And they imported a rabbi from Plattsburgh who came and lived with us. And while he was there, my father insisted that we girls take lessons too from him. In fact, in many ways, my father was very liberal. One doesn't appreciate it at the time, you know. But whatever the boys had to do or learn, he insisted that the girls do the same thing or learn the same thing. And so that when we came to Suffern at the age of 6, I knew the alphabet. And then I started regular Hebrew school, which even in Suffern consisted of about 8 kids. And I went for a few years. I don't know how many. I never learned very much. I learned to babble Hebrew fairly rapidly, but half the time I didn't understand what I was doing or why.
You said that when you were in Port Henry, there were very few other Jewish families there.
There were none. I don't
except-
think there were any.
Right.
Except for my uncle.
Do you have a recollection whether at that tender age of 6, whether you were aware that you were religiously different from the other people who lived in the area?
No. Shortly after we came to Suffern, the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross on a part of the Ramapo chain called the Huvenkopf Mountain. And I did not understand why this fire was going on, but it was a terrifying sight. And then my mother explained to me around that age that there were groups of people who hated Jews and hated blacks and were generally hate mongers. And that was my first experience with anti-Semitism.
What was the demographic pattern of the students who attended Suffern High School with you?
Largely Protestant. Largely Protestant.
Did you have the feeling of being a minority at that time in your Suffern neighborhood?
I really don't know. I don't. I'm sure that there were kids who didn't like Jews. My best friend's mother was a Jew hater and did not like her daughter going around with me one bit and made no bones about it. But her daughter was a very independent woman, and we managed to preserve a long relationship, a close relationship, and a long one until she died a couple years ago.
Did the fact that you were, so to speak, persona non grata to her mother have any kind of emotional impact upon you?
Oh, I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did. But I will say one thing about suffering and my parents. There were people in my life who contributed enormously to my self-esteem, such as the librarian at the local library. And she really was an amazing woman. There was a rule, I think it was prevalent everywhere, that people couldn't take out more than 2 books at a time. But she said to me that I could take as many as I pleased at any time. Well, can you imagine what this did for the self-esteem of a poor farm kid, you know? So that, oh, I'm sure there was a lot of negativism in the county, and it was not only anti-Jewish, but anti-intellectual. If you could pronounce Tigris, Euphrates, there was something wrong with you, you know, and people made jeers and jibes. Now, those never bothered me a bit, and I think I was fairly popular, you know. It was a case of being a, quote, white Jew, if you understand.
You mentioned before that after leaving high school, you went to college and then subsequently to law school. As a college undergraduate, as a college student, what aroused an interest in you for the law?
Well, frankly, I wasn't interested in the law. I kind of backed into it. I wanted to be an actress, and I was told I had absolutely no talent for that. So then I thought I would teach, and my last few months at Syracuse, at some point, I was practice teaching in Syracuse, and had an incident with some very disruptive boys. And the dean of the School of Education said he could never recommend me for a teaching job. So you see, there was nothing left for me but to go into the law, which my brother had been urging on me for some years. Mm-hmm. Not for some years, maybe a year or 2. And I had worked in his law office a couple summers as a youngster, so I guess that was the only alternative.
What was there about the disruption that you had with the students that would make the school official come to a conclusion? That
I used a swear word. I think I said damn. I think it was something like shut your damn mouths or something like that. It was certainly not the kind of profanity that we hear today.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were getting to be a young adult at the time that the Nazis were rising to power in Europe. How were you or your family affected by your knowledge of what was going on there?
I really was not terribly affected, but I know that my parents were from 1936 on, maybe even earlier, but particularly with the passage of the Nuremberg laws. They were, my father was a newspaper reader. And although there was precious little in the papers at that time about the Nazis, whatever there was, he read, and of course, they would both listen to every speck of news on radio when they got a radio, which was around, I guess, 1935 or so, maybe slightly earlier.
And did you have any relatives who still lived in Europe who were affected in any way by the rise of Nazism?
My father thought that his parents had died before the Nazis took over, but my father felt that he did have some siblings over there. It was a very large family. And there was one sister who survived. One brother, the oldest in the family, was killed by the Nazis. But one sister actually survived, and my brother Sidney went to Europe after my father died and looked for them in a kind of a deserted section of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, before World War I. And he found survivors, and some nephews and nieces, and this one aunt.
Mm-hmm. Did he ever share with you and the family members about the stories that they told him about their survival and what happened to the family?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. In fact, my aunt told me the story of their survival. They lived in a very remote farm section. It was really part of Slovakia, what is today Slovakia. And it was, there were no roads leading into the place. My brother got someone to take him in a Jeep, and it was over a dirt road, and they were driving through open fields and things of that sort to this tiny town. And she hid in the woods with 2 children. I don't know what they survived on. She called it roots. She would boil roots of Lord knows what, whatever she could find. And in fact, they didn't know the war was over for about 6 months.
You said that she had told you this. I gather she came to America eventually?
No, she wanted to go to Israel. And she went to Israel, and I visited her there in 1962.
Mm-hmm. Now, coming back to, you said about how you described how you backed into law.
Yes.
What was your feeling about law as a career during the time that you went to law school?
Well, I felt, this is very mundane, but I felt it was the only profession that I could make a living in. All of my friends, college friends, were, like me, English majors, and all of them wanted to go into publishing. And of course, there were no jobs. I think that one out of the dozens who would go to the book publishers might have got a job. Mm-hmm. That was on a magazine. So my brother had a law office. He wanted me in the office, and at least I could presumably after interning and clerking for a couple of years, presumably I could earn my own living.
Did you feel that you had learned quite a bit in working with your brother?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And how
well, at the beginning, he had this real nut notion that I ought to become acquainted with the city court system. This is June 1940, and that I ought to get experience down there. So I would look through the law journal and mark off who might be hiring somebody. I'd get on the bus in Suffern, go down to Wall Street, which is where the only hiring took place, and I would look at the crowd in the hall leading to the office. Crowd of men married with children. And most of the time I would turn around, and I did get a job briefly, and all I did was serve summons. So I got to know a little bit, never a great deal about the subway system in Manhattan, but no law. When I gave that up as a lost cause, and don't forget, there were a lot of strikes against me, being a woman, number one, being Jewish, number two. So I quit that pretty fast, and when I went to work for my brother, I learned a great deal because he had me doing everything. He had me drafting complaints and other legal documents, and he had me going to court and answering calendars and all kinds of things. So I think that in that general practice, I got very good experience.
How long did you remain?
Because of the personal interest, you see.
How long did you remain in your brother's firm?
2 years.
And what did you do subsequently?
Well, after war broke out, in the summer of 1942, my brother's being drafted was imminent, and he was going off to war, and he felt that it was wonderful that I could take care of the practice while he was gone. But I had no intentions of doing that. I said to him, "You're going to war, and I'm going to war." And I considered briefly going into the Waves because there was a big ad in the New York Times that said that if you went to Smith College for a couple months of basic training, you'd be commissioned as an officer. And I considered that briefly, but a judge, a very well-known judge, Jerome Frank, who visited here in the summertime, thought that it was a great waste of legal education for me to do that. And he said that the agencies in Washington really needed women lawyers because the men were going off to war. And so he introduced me to the Treasury, and that was the start of my Treasury career.
And what position did you have when he... At the end of the last tape, you were describing to us that you had left your brother's firm and went to Washington, that Judge Frank had recommended that you do. What was the nature of the work that you found there?
I worked in the General Counsel's office. The General Counsel was Randolph Paul, of a firm of Paul Weiss Garrison and so on. It's a very well-known law firm in New York and all over the country. And Randolph, the General Counsel's office consisted of about, at that time, 40 people, 40 lawyers. And Paul would assign his lawyers to various bureaus of the Treasury, Customs, Internal Revenue, the firearms control and tobacco and things of that, all the bureaus. At that time, Foreign Funds Control, to which I was assigned, was a rather new bureau which had been set up in the Treasury to administer the Trading with the Enemy Act, which forbade any communication whatsoever with German nationals and froze all of their assets that we could find in the United States.
And what specifically was your assignment in that area?
It was very general. When I started work there, I would screen intercepts which we got from the post office, from the Army, from Customs. These intercepts would pertain to every remittance that somebody was making. Somebody was sending a handkerchief to her sister in Bulgaria, and we would get word of that. And we would screen those intercepts and decide whether it was worthy of investigation or not. And in many cases, we would send out what we called a blocking telegram to the banks, telling them that this person's bank accounts had to be frozen, or we would do whatever was indicated.
How would you explain exactly what the term intercepts means to a layman?
It was a synopsis of a communication or a remittance or any transaction that was taking place with Germany or occupied Europe, many of the countries of occupied Europe.
Mm-hmm. And was there anything specifically that you did with respect to this work?
Subsequently, I was assigned to the investigation of I.G. Farben's external assets in this country, and even more particularly to General Aniline and Film, which was their huge subsidiary in the United States. And of course, once one got involved with General Aniline and Film, that led to all of the subsidiaries set up by the Germans in conjunction with their American counterparts in the beginning in the mid-30s or even earlier, to camouflage their assets and cloak their assets. I'm talking about companies like Jasco and Chemnico, all of which were basically German-owned and basically subsidiaries of I.G. Farben.
Now, did you, was this solely your responsibility, or were you part of a team that was doing all of this investigating of I.G. Farben?
I headed the team, and I didn't supervise the investigators, but I was in constant contact with them, and that culminated in the writing of a report on General Aniline and Film, which was a couple hundred pages long. And it culminated in the vesting of the properties that we had good reason to believe were were I.G. Farben.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea what use was made of the report that you or your team submitted?
Well, yes, it resulted in vesting At that time, Treasury vested the properties, took title to them. Then, when the alien property custodians started functioning again, because the office had fallen into decline after World War I, then we turned all the properties over to the alien property custodian working out of the Justice Department.
What gave you the expertise and the knowledge to follow along the lines of these investigations as to the ownership of IG properties and so forth?
Oh, I don't think I had any great background. My background, of course, as soon as I got involved in this, I started reading, going to lectures on Germany, the Third Reich, German history, the history of the roles that IG Farben and other industries had played in Germany from before World War I through the 20s and 30s.
Did you feel at the time that your report indicated that what you were searching for, that is the ownership of IG properties here in the States, was had reached a successful conclusion, that you found what you were looking for?
We did, with respect to the companies I've identified. But I don't think we ever uncovered all of their assets, certainly not in South America. Now, the investigation in the United States led to the identification of various factories and banks and warehouses throughout South America. IG Farben was like an octopus. It really covered the globe. It had establishments and installations in every major city of the world, I think. In the East, I can't think of any except Hong Kong and Shanghai, but it was a very far-flung enterprise.
Did your unit have either the desire or the power to follow up and to try to do something about the IG assets, let's say in South America, which you mentioned?
Oh, yes, we did, but by then I was doing different things. And I don't know how much we did and how much the alien property custodian did. Of course, you know that the Justice Department had been suing the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department had been suing Standard Oil for years, and much of it related to their cartel arrangements with IG Farben and German industries generally.
Did you continue to work in this area after you submitted your report?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, but then my work was more directly related to occupation matters. We were in North Africa, and Colonel Bernard Bernstein, who had been the head of Foreign Funds Control, he was an assistant secretary of the Treasury, had become Eisenhower's financial advisor, and he really didn't even know me. I think we had just met. Maybe it was introduced to him when he left the Treasury. But he would still be on he still considered Treasury his private staff, and he rarely made requests to the War Department that weren't routed through the Treasury and more often directly to the Treasury.
And why did you bring his name up now? Was it, were you going to continue and explain how you related
Oh, yes,
to him?
because then I became almost exclusively involved with occupation matters, with, at one point I was off Germany and wrote a book on Yugoslavia, on their financial laws and institutions, because at that time they thought we would invade Europe either through Italy or the Balkans. So I wrote a book about Yugoslavia at that time, about their financial setups, their institutions, and the laws that had to be annulled or repealed as soon as we walked in there.
Now, the first occupied territory that we had there was in North Africa, and I think you said that Bernard Bernstein was Ike's financial deputy and in North Africa. Were you involved in any of the work that he had in North Africa? In other words, did he send for you or work with you?
No, he, Du Bois, Josiah Du Bois, who was my immediate superior, was spending more and more time over there in North Africa, and he too was issuing orders to Treasury personnel in connection with currency control, a lot in connection with currency controls and export-import controls.
Now, how did that affect you and the work you were doing?
Well, I was usually at the receiving end of these requests for reports and data and information that they had to have.
Was that information in North Africa that was somewhat analogous to what you had done with Yugoslavia?
Well, it wasn't, no, it wasn't the least bit analogous. It was one thing that Bernstein and Du Bois decided to do while the Army and the Allies were thinking of where to invade Europe, you see. It really had nothing to do with currency controls, except insofar as they had to know what the currency controls were in Yugoslavia and Italy, what the export-import controls were, and their foreign exchange setups. In other words, they had to know about all of these fiscal matters so that they would be in a position not only to govern but to occupy these countries. And then, of course, we had problems with our own currency. We were issuing scrip, and our soldiers were forbidden to traffic in U.S. dollars. But, of course, they did, and, you know, they'd come home and they would repatriate thousands of greenbacks on a salary of $50 a month, and whenever they were questioned about it, they'd won it in a poker game. That was the standard answer, you remember. But all of these things were in preparation for the Allied invasion of Europe and Germany.
And how long did you do this preparatory work in your bureau in Washington?
until February of 1945. And then I went to London, where the Allied War Crimes Commission had begun their meetings. I wasn't sent over there specifically for the war crimes thing, but I kept in touch with the commission and reported, excuse me, reported on their decisions and, of course, their discussions, their negotiations, and all of the things that culminated in the London Agreement of 1945 and the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, which tried the major war criminals.
Explain what these documents were for us, please.
Which document? The Charter?
The London, yes.
The Charter governed the trials, both substantively and to a small extent procedurally. And they defined the crimes for which the defendants were being indicted. Crimes against the peace, which was the waging, the planning, and the preparation for and the waging of aggressive war. Conspiracy to commit aggressive war. The plunder of the occupied countries, which was called spoliation. And then, of course, war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Now, you said that you were reporting on this. Do you mean that you were in London becoming informed about the work of the Allied Control Commission and reporting back to the Treasury? Is that what your job was there?
Yes.
And how long did you...
But not really. It was just, I would do that peripherally. I was reporting on other things. I was reporting on some banking matters, largely involving the Swiss banks, and foreign exchange concerns of the Treasury.
And was it Du Bois?
General fiscal stuff, right. You know.
And was it Du Bois, as your immediate superior, who gave you the...
Not at that time. At that time, in Washington, it was a lawyer by the name of Joe Friedman. Who had been at the Philippines when I first went to the Treasury. And I'm sorry, does that answer your question?
Yes, so it was Friedman who gave you your marching orders, so to speak, and tell you what to investigate and what they needed information for and so forth.
And the General Counsel, Joe O'Connell, at that time had replaced Randolph Fall, and he was replaced by Tom Lynch. And occasionally they would make requests, and certainly my reports were directed to the General Counsel or to Joe.
Mm-hmm. And how long did you remain in London after February 45 doing this work?
Not long, about till June of 45, the middle of June, when my father died. And I tried to get home because at the time my brother called me, it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, London time, and I got a plane out of London the ambassador's private plane, which took me to Prestwick, Scotland. But then immediately, through the help of a friend of mine who was in the Air Corps there, got on the plane immediately, but the plane had a lot of trouble, and it wandered around the globe a couple times and came back to Prestwick and started off again. So that not only was my father not alive when I got back, but he had his funeral had been over, and the family were trying to find out where I was.
Mm-hmm. And what happened subsequently?
And then subsequently, I did not go back to, I didn't go back to London. I was supposed to. I continued my work in Washington as the, quote, German desk.
And at the German desk, did you continue with your investigation of I.G. Farben?
Oh, yes. Now, I have skipped over a very important part of my work. In the fall of 1944, by then, we had occupied Germany. And the Finance Division and the Decartelization Division under Colonel Bernstein were busy getting documents from the Farben administration building in Frankfurt and elsewhere in Germany, but mainly in Frankfurt. These men came home with gunny sacks full of material and documents, and they were deposited in my office at the Treasury, and we wrote a report to the Senate subcommittee investigating our resources for war, the exact title of which I will show you, and I will show you the report, along with the voluminous exhibits to the report. I worked on that night and day for some months at the end of 44. And I think the testimony was the report was dated November or December of 1944, and it involved an enormous amount of screening and working with these wonderful men and the soldiers in the divisions I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And how many people were involved in going through this mountain of material that you had received and trying to make sense of it?
The men who brought them home, who brought them back to Washington, the soldiers who were all named in the preface to the report, Abe Weisbrot and Neil Devine, and there were many people who, none of whom came to the actual Nuremberg trials, but many of them worked after the war in military government in Germany.
Now, when you were going through this material in Washington, was that with the aim of getting the kinds of war crimes materials that the Allied Control Commission had specified were to be used in trials?
I don't quite understand that question, but certainly the exhibits, the original exhibits to the reports and to Bernstein's testimony and to Major General Hildring, head of the Civil Affairs Department, those exhibits were used over there. In fact, my husband who you are going to interview later, will talk about the documents that were involved in the compilation of the work and the report and the testimony.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you make a précis or a summary of these and submit that to the Senate committee? Did I understand you correctly?
Oh, there were no précis. The exhibits were the actual documents, which I will discuss when you think it appropriate. Two documents in particular, which you know, every person on the prosecution staff had one document that he thought was such a stellar exhibit, and I too have a couple of those.
Now, how did the material that you were working on get you involved in the actual war crimes trials that were to take place in Nuremberg?
Well, Bill, my husband, was sent to Washington. He had been at Nuremberg for some months, and trying to set up the organization for the trials subsequent to the international military trial, which before the decision was handed down in the Goering case, which is what I call the IMT. They had already named General Taylor chief counsel for the purpose of carrying on these subsequent proceedings consisting of 12 trials. And Bill was doing initial work for him in the nature of setting up document centers and tracing documents which related not only to I.G. Farben, but I think the German general staff. And he, after looking all over, he eventually ended up in my office, and that's a story which he tells.
Right. Now you weren't,
he describes it. What?
I'm sorry. You weren't already married to him at that
time?
Oh,
no, never met him.
So
I never even met.
Right. So he came over to Washington, sharing his materials with you, and that's how you kind of segued into the...
He was looking for materials. He was looking for documents which he knew existed. He knew the report existed. He was looking for the exhibits to the report, which were original documents. And that's how he eventually got to my office.
And those are the documents that you had that could be given to him.
Right.
We will now pause for a change of tapes. This is tape number 3 in the interview with Mrs. Belzec. At the end of the last tape, you were telling us about Bill's coming to Washington looking for materials for the war crimes trials in Nuremberg.
Right.
Tell us what happened subsequently in your relations with him with respect to the materials.
At first, I must admit, I was rather hostile because, you see, I had deposited copies of these documents with the ETO, the European Theater, in the European Theater, and with the Pentagon, and of course the Senate had the originals. So I was rather, he announced that he was taking the documents. He said, Ms. Mayer, this is exactly what I was looking for, and thank you, I'm going to take them back to Germany. And I said, no, you're not going to take these back to Germany, because, and my thinking was that the Pentagon lost everything, including a whole set of these documents. They lost a shipload of rubber boots that were destined for the Battle of the, for Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge, when our poor men were freezing off their feet there in Belgium. It was, so I was a little hostile, but eventually he persuaded me that he had to go back. This was, say, a Friday. He had to return the following Monday because he wanted to hear the decision in the IMT. And so I asked him if he had clout with the War Department and could get Treasury reimbursed if the men copied those documents over the weekend. And he said yes, they could, and he makes a big story out of the fact that $41 in overtime was involved. But the Treasury people did copy every one of the documents, and they were all, he had gone to Manhattan to see his folks over the weekend, and when he came back Monday morning, he had all the gunny sacks of all the documents. And they were pretty voluminous, as you will see when I show you the fine print of the book containing the exhibits to the Bernstein testimony.
Incidentally, I don't think when you first mentioned the acquisition of these gunny sacks having been brought over to Washington, I don't think that we had, I had asked you where and how did they get these gunny sacks?
Well, as I told you, in North Africa, Bernstein had lassoed everyone in North Africa, largely infantrymen, who had had previous Treasury experience or banking experience or had been involved in finance. And they went with him all through Italy and on to Germany. And in Germany, they were the core of the finance division and the decartelization division. And one of the first things they did was go into the Farben building, which in Frankfurt, which was Farben's administration building. And they just packed up all these documents and memoranda and orders and brought them back to Washington.
I see. I'm sorry.
And they also, this is very important, they also interrogated Farben people. George von Schnitzler, who played a major role in the in Hitler's career, and he was a director. They had statements from him. They had statements from the top Farben bookkeeper and general and from Farben's general counsel, von Knierim, Knierim, and whom Bill also had already interrogated at length. But all of these statements and all of their interrogations, but most of all of the documentation that they brought back. Do you want at this point for me to give you an example of the kind of documents they brought back?
If you wish, sure.
Shortly, a couple of years after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, 1933, the Farben people had a meeting of their board of directors, the Vorstand, and they discussed their experience during World War I with respect to their American properties being confiscated by used the word confiscated by the United States government. And they began planning for camouflaging their ownership of companies in the United States. And Von and the General Counsel of I.G. Farben wrote a long memorandum in which he recited what had happened in World War I and how important it was to take immediate steps and to transfer stock ownerships, patents, licensing agreements, and so on to neutrals, to American citizens, and to Swiss, particularly to their what he called our Swiss friends. And this was a very important document because it outlined their plans, and then we followed up showing how these plans were executed. They formed a Swiss company, all Swiss nationals, and some Americans, but predominantly Swiss, called IG Chemie, C-H-E-M-I-E. And incidentally, I might say that IG are not the initials of a man, as people think when you say IG Farben. It stands for Interessengemeinschaft, which is a combination, a concern, a trust. And IG Chemie was the titular owner of General Ammerman and Film. But of course, during the investigation I've been talking about, the cloak was penetrated, and you would go through layers of nominees, absolute layers, before you could get to who owned that company.
So these are the kinds of materials then that you turned over to Bill.
Right.
Now, what did you do with respect to your work after that particular incident?
Well, then, after Bill went back to Germany, he told Telford Taylor that he thought I would be a valuable addition to the prosecution staff where I.G. Farben was concerned. And Telford apparently told him, again, this is for him to tell you about, to get me over, and he sent me a cable through the War Department asking me to come over. And just as he started these cables coming, urging me to come over there, the decision came down in the IMT. And both Schacht, a financial man, and Speer, who was head of war production, were acquitted. And, well, no, Speer was given time in jail, but Schacht was acquitted. And that just finished me where I'd had any desire to go over there. In other words, I thought, if they can acquit Schacht, they're going to acquit I.G. Farben too, or be very lenient in their sentences, which in fact turned out to be true. But nonetheless, I did go over there. About later.
Could you clarify?
Several months later. Many months.
Could you clarify for us why you at first did not want to go over and then changed your mind?
The acquittal of Schacht. The acquittal of Schacht, because he was one of the towering figures in banking and industry, particularly banking, and I felt that he was so closely tied to the industrialists and they to him in so many ways.
Now, what specific role did Bill have in mind for you to accept?
Just to work on preparation for the trial.
When you agreed to do that, what was your expectation about the process of putting the I.G. Farben leaders on trial?
What were my expectations? Well, without I.G. Farben and its tremendous resources, particularly U.S. dollars, foreign exchange, Hitler simply couldn't have waged war. Without their stockpiling of critical war material, he couldn't have moved a plane. And then, when it came to actual production, I.G. Farben was just spread over the Wehrmacht and the Air Force. I mean, the tires on the airplanes, the treads on the tanks. They manufactured over 90% of the explosives in Germany because of their World War, their long experience with fixing nitrates. And so they were manufacturing nitrogen for the bombs that flew over London. Every bomb had their signature on it. And there is no question in anyone's mind that they were indispensable in the planning of the war. And this we showed by, well, let me go back a bit. In 1933, after Hitler and the Nazis had lost an election badly, in a previous election in 1932, he had captured about, let's say, 30% of the houses in Parliament, which was not a staggering figure. It couldn't begin to approach the Catholic Church's Center Party or the Social Democrats. And Krupp called a meeting of I.G. Farben and Fleck and a few other industrialists, called them to a meeting at Goering's home. And Hitler spoke at that meeting. And he gave one of his interminable speeches, the gist of which was that Germany had only been prominent and important under a strong man. And it was the manifest destiny of Germany to rule Europe. And he just laid out his plans as well as he did in Mein Kampf, and a book that very few people read or even believed. But Farben, I.G. Farben, was the biggest contributor. They gave at that time 500,000 Deutsche Marks, which amounted to a couple $100,000, and that was a staggering political contribution at that time. Well, in the United States, it would have been staggering too. And they made it clear to Hitler that they would make him Chancellor of Germany, in return for which Hitler applauded their expansionist aims and indicated that whatever money there was in Germany would be available to them for their experiments in synthetic oil, for which they had the patents and the licensing agreement from Standard Oil of New Jersey in synthetic rubber, and where labor was concerned and everything else. And once von Schnitzler got that commitment, now the other industrialists, Krupp, of course, was a munitions maker, and Flick was the coal baron of Germany. And as a matter of fact, in 1928, the way the report to the Senate starts, I start with a statement from Chancellor Stresemann, who in a moment of great despair said, "What have I got besides IG and the coal people?" And the report continues that he really didn't need anything more than IG and the coal people, because their inventive wizardry, you see, could take coal tar and make 1,000 products out of it that I can't even enumerate. And they all they had was coal and air and water, but they really parlayed that into the biggest army and the best equipped army that the world had ever seen up to that time.
Now, what you're describing is the kind of research that you did, that you handed over to the prosecutorial staff for them to use in the war crimes trial. Do I understand that correctly?
Right.
Okay. Now, before we get into the actual trial, I wonder if you could help us by describing something of the legal background about the trial. For example, you mentioned that the Allied Control Council had issued a charter.
Our procedures were governed by Allied Control Council Law number 10. And, well, of course, we were substantively bound by the charter, and we charged I.G. Farben with all of the crimes that were defined in the charter. Of course, when I say defined, war crimes, the killing of innocent civilians and hostages, and the mistreatment of prisoners of war had been covered since 1897 in the Geneva Convention of that year, and then in 1926 by the Locarno and the Geneva treaties of that year. But Allied Control Council Law number 10 is important in that, having had the ghastly experience of a quadripartite trial and trying to, and having to function in 4 different languages, they said that any evidence which would be probative would be admissible. That is very, very important. In other words, if we didn't have the original of a document, if it got lost and papers got lost and mislaid, a photostat of that document would be acceptable. If von Schnitzler recanted testimony which he had given in 1944 to the Finance Division. We could, even if he recanted, we could introduce that original statement because it was authenticated. However, it might not have on it the oath. Let's say the oath that people take when they sign a court document. Well, what upset me personally with my colleagues at Nuremberg is, particularly Drexel Sprecher, was that he was insisting that all of these documents be re-authenticated. It wasn't as if thousands weren't coming in of fresh documentation to support these various charges, but he was re-authenticating things that of which there was no question as to their validity.
Now, I'm sorry.
But I know why he did it, but I didn't know that until years later, reading what went on at the International Military Tribunal with Sir Hartley Shawcross just refusing to take evidence that didn't have an oath on it and all the sealing wax and ribbons. I'm using that as a metaphor. I could see where Sprecher was being very, very careful. I could understand him at the time. Trying to get the case into court was a nightmare with this re-authentication nonsense, and also we were leaning backwards to help the defendants. It wasn't just a matter of the charter saying that we would make available help for a proper defense. It wasn't just that. Voluntarily, we would go hunting up witnesses for them and giving them documents. Well, the documents that we put in evidence, they got a minimum of 24 hours notice of. And this, I may tell you, required the most intricate planning to know that you were going to use such and such document on a given day and get it to 100 copies of it to defense counsel in advance. And we leaned over backwards because we didn't want to be accused of victor's justice. That's in quotation marks. It was the name of a book that Novaski wrote, saying that the trials were unfair.
Now, according to the Allied Control Council, coming back again to the legal aspect of it, how were cases brought before the tribunal?
The Nuremberg Tribunal. Well, it was decided that because the quadripartite trial was such a nightmare mechanically, and not that I.G. Farben wasn't, but it was even worse when you had 4 different systems of law, 4 different languages and so on, or 3 different languages. I'm forgetting your question. I'm sorry.
The question was, how were, according to the Allied Control Council, how were the cases brought to the court?
Oh, it was decided then that we would try the defendants in our zone of influence in Germany, and the Allies would try the defendants in their zones. I must tell you right now that we did a far more thorough job, or attempted to, than even the British, who were pretty good too. But the French did practically nothing, and the Russians did very little. But but during the IMT, there was so much evidence of the complicity of hundreds of people other than the 21 or 24 defendants in the dock, you know, that that formed the basis for the 12 subsequent trials. And that's what my husband was working on with General Taylor and his deputies at the courthouse, was deciding on these various groupings of cases, so that one group were the industrialists, Farben, Krupp, and Flick. They were selected. Another group was the German General Staff, and then the Einsatzgruppen in Eastern Europe were plain murderers. And the judges of the infamous People's Courts, and the doctors who did medical experiments on the inmates in the camps and elsewhere.
Now, did the, so if I understand you correctly, the trials that were taking place in the American zone were largely American trials, presumably with American judges.
Yes.
What was the role of the judges in the trial?
Well, they listened to the evidence and they rendered a decision.
And who were they?
In the Farben case, or
the Farben case?
Judge Shake, Morris, and Hebert, and then there was an alternate.
And who were the leading prosecutors in the IG trial?
I would say Drexel Sprecher was what we would call today the lead trial attorney, or it developed that he was. We thought Joe Du Bois would be, but between the two of them, they were the lead lawyers.
How many attorneys did the prosecuting staff have all told?
I have to guess at that. I would say 20 assigned to various counts of the indictment.
All right, we're now going to pause for a change of tapes in the interview with Mrs. Belzec. This is tape number 4 in the interview with Mrs. Belzec. In the last tape, you had told us about the leading prosecutors on the prosecuting side. Who were the most important or leading defendants who were in the dock?
They were the directors of IG Farben, the actual managing directorate, with a few very important plant managers. Actually, I think they were directors, though, too. And their chief scientist, a man by the name of Termeer, T-E-R, and a separate word, M-E-E-R.
And whom would you, first of all, how many defendants were there in total?
21.
And were there any, we don't want to go through a list of all 20 defendants, were there any that in your memory stand out as the most significant or important of the defendants?
Without question, I think it was Termeer, the scientist I just mentioned. He had a very novel defense, it seemed to me. You know, most of the defendants had a standard defense. They never knew that such things were taking place as the extermination of the Jews. Trenier had a novel defense which apparently made a tremendous impression on the court. He said, these people were going to die anyhow. We, I.G. Farben, with our Cyclone B gas and our sarin, which we called Serene at the time, but when it was used on that Japanese train in Japan, the newscasters referred to it as sarin, and taboon, these three poison gases. He said these people were going to die anyway, and we gave them the blessings of a swift and merciful death. Of course, at the same time, they were burning people up, bodies up, and he thought nothing of that. And in the actual Buna rubber factory that Farben conducted on the Auschwitz or Monowitz site, because of the availability of labor, of concentration camp labor, and they just worked these people until they died. And at their factory itself, they had trap doors and would just throw the bodies of workers who died of fatigue and malnutrition and overwork and cruelty from the SS guards who were right in the factory, quote, keeping order. They'd throw them right there they'd open these trap doors and throw them in the cellar of the actual factory.
Now, in addition to collecting and preparing all of these materials for presentation at the trial, did you have any other specific role in the trial proceedings?
No, I accept that the first count of the indictment, as I told you, was planning preparation for aggressive war. And so right at the beginning of the trial, I was in court introducing documents.
When you say
which showed I.G. Farben's complicity in the whole German Gestalt, the whole Nazi program.
In presenting the documents, were you asked to speak to the judges at the trial?
Yes. Oh, yes. I would tell them what the document was, or who had made the statement and the circumstances under which the interrogation was taken, and so on. And of course, I had earphones on, and there were 21 defendants' lawyers sitting there who kept making objections. And after a while, I must confess to you that I decided I was never going to get my documents and other things in evidence, interrogations, if I listened to had to sit there and stand there and listen to their objections. I just took my earphones off.
How long did the trial go on, and how long did you remain there as part of the trial?
A few months. Trial went on for over a year.
So, in other words, you weren't there all the way through the trial?
No.
Where were you housed at the time of the trial?
The Grand Hotel.
Can you describe, from your own eyewitness viewpoint, how did the defendants, as they filed into the court, appear to you?
Unfortunately, they looked like rather shabby but very dignified businessmen. And as you know, the court became convinced that they were just businessmen, just like DuPont, who were doing their patriotic duty.
knowing what you had learned in the preparatory work, how did you feel when you looked at those men and they gave you that impression?
Well, let me go back a little bit, if I may, and back into your question, back into the answer. In Washington, I was absolutely horrified at the revelations that came out of every document. Just appalled at the bestiality of the Nazis. When I got to Nuremberg, though, and as cumulative evidence kept coming in, I just, it was so staggering. It was what the lawyer Herbert Krauss, for Shocked, called a gigantic travesty of moral abominations. I became rather numb, I'm sorry to say, and to a point where I remember snapping at one analyst who brought me a document showing that, let's say, 5 people were injected with typhoid fever. And I said, don't bring me documents with 5 people being injected with typhoid fever when we have reports showing that 500 were involved. That kind of not callousness really, but absolute numbness by virtue of the sheer repetition of these atrocities. Does that answer your question about my feelings? So that there was one defendant in particular, Max Ilgner, who was the nephew of von Schnitzler's, who was head of the salesmen, whom they called the Verdingensmänner, who were really spies for Germany all over South America. And I had some history with him, and he was a rather despicable, loudmouth kind of person who said that he had been subjected to a lot of indignities before the trial, but that his greatest indignity was being subjected to interrogation by a woman. And then this tall Texan, whose nickname was Tex, whom Telford Taylor, in his huge book, Tyranny on Trial, devoted a chapter to, because he became convinced that it was he who had slipped the cyanide pill to Goering in the jail and had done Emmy Goering many favors and in return had gotten many presents from her, including wristwatches and of Goering's and so on. They had apparently became very cozy, but at that time Tex was a good friend of mine who would admit me to the courthouse when I'd forgotten my pass and things like that. And he brandished a gun at Ilgner, and Ilgner started answering the questions. And that was largely about their spying in South America, their salesmen, so-called salesmen.
Now, what kind of security did the authorities feel it was necessary at the trial?
Oh, there was, well, no one could get into the courthouse without being frisked. Not the civilians, but anybody in military uniform. They would question because, of course, there were saboteurs, I guess, but security was no problem. It really was not a problem. One did, whether one was a civilian or not, have to show your pass on entering the courthouse. That was about all. There was no extraordinary security. I mean, the soldiers at all times were bringing the prison personnel were bringing the defendants from the jail to the dock and escorting them back and surrounding them in the courtroom. But aside from that, anybody could walk in there, as many visitors did. And of course, the press. Well, the press had their own credentials.
But are you saying then that the general public was admitted also to see what was going on at the trial?
Well, they couldn't get into the courtrooms, only because of lack of space, as long as there was space. And it was before the day's proceedings commenced. The general public could get in. But most of the time, the seats were occupied by the press, and the general public could get in, but they might have to wait around for a couple hours.
Was there any kind of public reaction, either in the courtroom itself or through the media outside, that enabled you to gauge what the general German public felt about the trial?
That was very muted. American reaction, Washington reaction, State Department reaction to the trials was not muted at all. I might point out at this point that the Secretary Byrne of the State Department, before the trial even started, had made his famous Stuttgart speech, in which he said that we were going to have to fight the Russians and we needed the Germans on our side. And so here, the Congress is all set to fight Russia, and the State Department, I'm painting with a broad brush here, and the War Department has what Bill called this damp, unmanageable baby on its lap, the war crimes trials. I will say this, that the War Department, and particularly Secretary Patterson, deserve so much credit, because contrary to what a lot of people have said, the War Department, to the effect that the War Department wanted to pull the rug on us, I can tell you, and I'm sure that General Taylor agrees with this. In fact, at reunions, he has voiced his agreement with what I said, that the War Department was just as cooperative as it could be to the bitter end, even after the House Un-American Committee accused the Farben prosecution of being communists right on the floor of the Congress, mainly Du Bois. They thought he was a Jew and therefore a communist, you know. But the fact that Joe Du Bois happened to be a French Huguenot whose ancestry in this country was pre-revolution, and that he was the son of the American Revolution, was not known to the people who were making these charges. against the prosecution. They left, and they say that they left me out of that one. But then, a few years later, I was accused of being a communist on the floor of the Congress. And I took care of that in my own way. I just got a retraction done very quickly through friends of mine in the Congress.
Who in the Congress had accused you?
Dondero of Michigan, who represented not his constituency, he represented Dow Chemical. And the interesting part of that was that I don't remember anything being said at the Farben trial about Dow Chemical. We never, I don't believe that we ever had any material whatsoever showing that, unlike I.G. Farben's complicity in all of Hitler's undertakings, I don't believe we had anything on Dow Chemical. I am sure that they had, I know they had an export-import relationship with Farben. But, and if they had cartel arrangements, they didn't amount to anything. And yet this Dondero accused me of being a well-known communist.
Now, since congressional speech on the floor of the Congress is privileged and they cannot be held accountable for that, how were you able to get a retraction?
Again, to digress, I must tell you that Franklin Roosevelt Jr., who was not noted for his daily attendance at sessions of the House, agreed to make a speech on my behalf. But I felt that this would draw too much attention to this nonsense, which was concurred in by an old fool from Glens Falls. I called a friend of mine, Sidney Yates, congressman from Chicago. When I say a friend of mine, I did a little lobbying after I came back from the trials for the British loan, particularly, which was having a hard time with the Jews in Congress. So that we had a very friendly relationship, and he was very much interested in the trials. Sidney Yates said to me, "I'll take care of it, Bill." And he went to see Dondero and this other man, a congressman from Glens Falls, who also had a one-entity representation in Congress, and that was to represent Ontario and Western Railroad. And he asked them how they knew me, and they said she was that short, skinny girl with black hair who worked for Kilgore. And Yates said, "You got the wrong person. She never worked for Kilgore." He wanted to see their documentation. And of course, they had none. It was a case of mistaken identity.
So your height and your blonde hair stood you in good
Yes.
respect at that time. Coming back to the trial itself and the time that you were there, were there any memorable courtroom incidents that stick in your mind after so many years?
One thing happened before the trial started, on the eve of the trial. Mary Taylor, Telford's wife, who was really not an army general's wife in that she, was not a society woman or bridge player, things like that, gave a luncheon for the wives of the Farben judges. And I attended it very briefly. But I was told that one of the women there had told Mrs. Morris that I was on the I.G. Farben staff and had to leave because the trial was imminent. And she said, all I can say is she better be good, because my husband says that he sees absolutely no difference between I.G. Farben and what any patriotic American company like DuPont would do in times of war. Well, I could have told him the difference, because our patriotic American companies had to be bribed to convert to wartime production by FDR, who gave them every tax concession that the Treasury could think up to get them to convert to wartime production. So that threw me into a real tizzy. And I talked to Du Bois and to Sprecher, and I suggested that we start with atrocities, with crimes against humanity, instead of this bewildering array of some thousands of charts and documents and things, which Sprecher insisted were very important to prove individual responsibility, which in the IMT had become a big issue, you see. In other words, they felt that it was very difficult to show the venality of the defendants without showing their capacity to do all these things, and to show their capacity. We had to go into the extent of their foreign holdings and their supplies, the stockpiling, and all the rest, which took months, literally, to put in the first 2 counts, to show how not only complicity, but to show that without them, that they were absolutely indispensable.
Did Sprecher persuade you of his viewpoint after you had that discussion?
Oh, yes. Well, I had felt that way from the beginning. And I had felt, in historical terms, that aggressive war was, the prosecution, not just in our case, but in every case, we were young and inexperienced, with 1 or 2 exceptions, because for reasons I'll give you later. But we were all idealists, and we wanted so much to establish the rule of international law in the world, and to strengthen international law, and to make the trials be a deterrent to future wars, which of course it wasn't.
In addition to what you've alluded to, were there any other difficulties under which you and the prosecutorial staff operated?
Just as it's impossible for a normal brain to deal with the Nazi murder of not just 6 million Jews, but millions of other nationals of other countries. just as it's impossible for people to comprehend that, it is impossible to understand the mechanical difficulties 50 years, 60 years later that we operated under. I mean, every page of every document had to have a stencil cut. They were the old-fashioned photocopy machines. We didn't have state-of-the-art typewriters even. We didn't have secretaries, skilled secretaries, who could make 8 or 9 copies at once on these old broken-down machines. And then this business that I discussed at some length before about helping the defendants prepare their cases. These mechanical problems were just backbreaking, and in fact, a good trial lawyer from New York, Abe Pomerantz, who was used to, a very successful one, who was used to pushing a button and having dozens of millions appear and carry out his instructions, just quit after a few months. And and many others, not just he, but others quit. You know, today with our Xeroxes and our fax machines, and we can duplicate an ordinary office, 40 documents at one time, and have them collated at the same time. It's hard to comprehend what that operation was like.
I think you implied before when you quoted the judge's wife as saying that he thought that these were just ordinary businessmen, and you've indicated the difficulties under which you're working. Do you think that that you might have been successful even if you hadn't had the difficulties?
I don't know. I really don't know.
All right, we're now going to pause for a change of tapes.
Okay, well, we're now...
This is tape number 5 in the interview with Mrs. Belzec. In the last tape, you were telling us about the various difficulties that that the prosecution faced in the trial. Did you, at any point during the trial, have reason to suspect any degree of anti-Semitism?
In the courthouse? No.
Or the trial in general?
No. Oh, no.
You told us before that you stayed there for a few months, but the trial went on for a long time afterwards. Why did you leave?
I was physically quite ill. When I had been ill when I had left Nuremberg and I was here in the States. And when I went back to put in the beginning of the trial, the first count of aggressive war, I was again asked to get in a Jeep with various personnel and take documents to be either signed or authenticated or have the people being questioned sign an oath. And this was like the night before the trial opened. So that it was just a backbreaking job. Charles LaFollette, the former congressman from Wisconsin, or I think Indiana, once remarked that he thought that the object of the trials was to punish the war criminals, punish the defendants, and all they were doing was killing the prosecution. And there was some truth to it, a little. They called the Farben office Ulcer Row. That might have applied to any of the trials in progress, but I did twice become ill there, once before the trial commenced and then a couple months after the trial started.
Approximately how many hours a day did you put in on the job there?
12.
Did you work weekends also?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And during the day, I worked at the courthouse, and after dinner, I would work in my room till 2 and 3 in the morning, because, for one thing, it was very difficult to concentrate. Now, the judges had fairly respectable offices. By that, I mean they had maybe a rug in their office, and some privacy. But I worked in a room with maybe 5 or 6 other people, and people would come, people would go. A newspaper reporter once asked me how I managed to concentrate, and I said, I don't, because it was virtually impossible with the typewriters clanking and people coming to ask me questions and things of that sort, and the analysts doing their thing and the translators, and so that most of my think work was done at night.
You mentioned a reporter coming there. Was there much in the local newspapers about the trial?
Oh yes, Stars and Stripes for one, and I don't remember whether the German papers were operational. I'm sure they were by then, but limited, very limited. And I had enough translating to do, and particularly watching out that translators didn't leave out whole paragraphs from documents without reading it. I don't recall reading any of the German papers, Das Tag, or the other well-known papers.
When you returned, did you return to your job in Washington? Did you
Yes.
continue to work for the Treasury?
Well, first I rested for a few weeks, and then I returned to my job. But and I was doing various repair jobs on my stomach and so on. And then I returned to Washington.
Did you continue to work with the foreign assets in I.G. Farben, or were you assigned to a different thing there?
No, I had very little to do more with I.G. Farben, except, of course, to cut every item in the United States newspapers about it, and to send various clippings to Du Bois and to Telford, and of course I was calling there to find out who was doing what, but when I came back, I was asked to work on the British loan. Mm-hmm. More of a lobbying job in Congress.
Mm-hmm. When you came and you looked for newspaper items, were you able to gauge what kind of coverage the war crimes trial was having in American newspapers here?
Well, I'll tell you, with the exception of the indictment, which incidentally was why I was looking for which was front page in the New York Times, anything about the trials was buried inside the newspaper. There was one amusing clipping in which Judge Morris was quoted as saying to Sprecher, "How many more documents along these lines do you intend to introduce?" And Sprecher said 500. And Judge Morris was very unhappy with that answer.
Were you still working at your office in the Treasury Department when the verdicts were handed down in the trial?
Yes. Yes.
Do you recall, I'm sorry, did that make bigger news stories in the American papers?
I think so. Mm-hmm. Yes.
What was your reaction when you read about it?
Well, of course, I had read the decision long before it appeared in the American newspapers. It had been sent to me very fast. We had restored communications by that time, and the text of the entire decision, as I recall it, was cabled to me, and of course I got a letter from General Taylor thanking me and saying how disappointed I must be at the decision, as was he. But he was convinced that we had made a major contribution to the cause of international law and so forth. But I was absolutely crushed. I could understand, I could even rationalize why they threw out the aggressive war count. And the reason for that is the precedent of the International Military Tribunal, which pretty well limited aggressive war charges to people who had participated in 4 conferences with Hitler, directly with Hitler. So I could rationalize that, even though I just disagreed with it totally and was terribly discouraged and disappointed. I could never rationalize the sentences that were given to the chief malefactors at Auschwitz and the people who were directly involved in the experiments and in the atrocities. I think that the longest sentence was 6 years. It was given to Ambrose and Dürrfeld and maybe one other. That was the longest sentence. Then the sentences were commuted by the time served. And then, of course, when McCloy became High Commissioner of Germany, he appointed a clemency commission which freed all of the prisoners, except for Hess in the main trial.
How did the outcome of the trial affect your feeling about the world scene or life in general, or the philosophical attitudes that you had?
Well, I can only say that I was horribly disappointed. And I couldn't talk about Germany or IG Farben or anything connected with the trials for years. And that was a feeling of great, it was mixed feelings. It was a matter of mixed feelings. For example, there were my feelings as an attorney that, well, you lost your case. Stop blaming it on the judges. You know, every time a lawyer loses a case, he says the judge was a bad judge. There was that feeling. I felt that it was better left unsaid. But the major feeling was that nobody could understand the enormity of these crimes. I felt that if we had tried a murder case of one person, as Ben Ferencz did with the Einsatz group, and they were strictly a murder case where the man had the only defense he put up that it wasn't 90,000 people, it was 60,000 or something like that, Ollendorf. But I just felt that no one could comprehend the numbers involved, the kind of cruelty that these people were capable of. And I don't think that many people even had, as Justice Jackson, not just Jackson, but Telford Taylor said in his opening statement at Farben, that not only did their crimes defy reason, but they staggered the imagination. And then, a few years after I came home, I did make one speech at the Women's Democratic Club in Washington. And once I was interviewed on luncheon with Sardis, and that was because of a close friendship with the person doing the interviewing. But by and large, what I started to say was a few years after I came back, a child was lost in a well in Texas, and the entire country held its breath until that child was rescued. The entire country. But 1 million little kids, 1 million children, no one could comprehend that kind of number.
Did you at that time, and do you now, agree with General Taylor's estimate that you had at least accomplished something in advancing respect for international law?
Well, I think we accomplished a great deal where international law was concerned. I think that the Nuremberg principles have become a very important part of international law, and certainly should be the basis for the establishment of a permanent international military court, which colleagues of mine, I am not an international law scholar, but Ben Ferencz and Henry Hill are. He's in Ohio. Ben, of course, is Westchester. But they have, and Whitney Harris in Missouri, in St. Louis. But they have been working for over 50 years on the strengthening of the United Nations and on the establishment of a permanent court. Now, whether they could transform The Hague into a permanent court, we don't know. But here again, the State Department pulled the rug out from under a conference in June in Italy, in Rome. We had felt that Clinton and Secretary of State Albright were absolutely committed to a permanent international court, but the State Department man called in all of his has worldwide colleagues, and he told them that they should discourage attendance, and they should talk to the military attachés and be sure that the military attachés knew that we would not go along with submitting the United States voluntarily to the jurisdiction of such a court, which is why I say they scuttled the thing. Now, it was signed in Rome, and people like Ferencz and Whitney Harris and Henry are so intrepid that they will continue going for another 50 years. And they, in fact, have pointed out to me that it took 40-odd years to get the Genocide Convention ratified, and here we had been the people who introduced it in the United Nations. And we had been instrumental in setting up the United Nations in the first place at Dumbarton Oaks and so on.
Did you think that the Eichmann trial in the 1960s advanced the cause of international punishment for criminals?
Well, yes, because in the sense that it wasn't so much a new thing in international law. It wasn't an addition of international law. It didn't set any precedents that had not already been there, but it was terribly important to let people who committed the kind of crimes Eichmann did, that there was no statute of limitations pending, applying to murder and torture, and that if it took 100 years, these people would be hunted down.
What opinion did you have of the Demjanjuk trial?
Of what trial?
Demjanjuk. He was the ex-concentration camp guard who was deported from the United States, tried in Israel.
I don't know really anything about him. He I don't know whether it was a case of mistaken identity. I rather believe it wasn't, because of the testimony in Israel, incidentally. Even though the verdict was such as it was. But I really don't know anything except what we read in the papers.
How do you feel about the more recent indictments of Karadzic and Mladic and now Milosevic in former Yugoslavia?
Well, I think it's a terrible disgrace. Mladic and Karadzic, how do you pronounce that?
I think it's Karadzic.
They were indicted some years ago before we even went into Bosnia, or at the same time, and they should have been apprehended immediately. And it wasn't as if they were eluding apprehension. It wasn't as if they hid themselves or anything. And now with Milosevic, I just hope that he doesn't manage to escape The Hague, too. I think it's terribly important. Another thing about the Nuremberg trials, which applies equally to this entire Bosnian, Albanian, Kosovo thing, massacre, I should call it, not a thing. Now I forget, but it was an important point, I thought, that that these people, that they're making, every one of these trials is making an irrefutable historical record. And that's what we did at Nuremberg. And think, when the revisionists came along and said, oh, it never happened, or it's an exaggeration, or this, that, and the other thing happened, all these revisionists in Europe and here too, isn't it wonderful that you can point to thousands of documents which were authenticated and re-authenticated and gotten into evidence under the most rigorous rules of evidence. And that's why it's terribly important that these three be tried in Geneva. At The Hague.
You cited before the work that Ferenc and others have been doing to promote the idea of the establishment of an international war crimes tribunal. Did you personally work with them or do anything along those lines?
Worked on resolutions at the only three reunions we have had of the people who worked at the Nuremberg trials. The latest was 2 years ago, when we passed two resolutions about Bosnia and the punishment of war criminals there, and another resolution about strengthening the United Nations and certainly paying the $1 billion we owed them, which Congress just refused to pay to them. But at the first reunion we passed, and I drafted these to answer your question, at the first resolution we felt that the apprehension of Iraq, Saddam Hussein should be the first call of business as soon as the shooting war was over by the United Nations. But these resolutions, they were all, I think, fairly widely circulated. They went to the White House. In fact, we got an acknowledgement from Clinton of the last two that we did, with congratulations and, you know, how great it was and what we had accomplished at the reunion. But so far there's been little follow-through.
Now, while you were over there, if we can digress from the trials for a moment, you were over in 1945, 1946, where a great deal was going on in the aftermath of the war in Europe. Did you have any opportunities while you were there to see what had happened to some of the Jewish survivors, or to partake in any way of any kind of rescue work or helping work with them?
Yes. I'm going to break this into two parts. I'm going to start in January of 45, which was the creation, January of 1944, the creation of the War Refugee Board. Joe Du Bois was tipped off by a newspaper man, a columnist of some fame in the country, that the famous or infamous Breckinridge Long was sitting on documents. And finally got hold of these documents, these cables from Europe, which described what was going on in the camps, and particularly one cable from Minister Garrison in Switzerland, who said that this situation called for immediate action on the part of the United States government. And I don't think I assisted in the writing, but I certainly went over the draft of the memorandum which Joe initially prepared for submission to Secretary Morgenthau. And this 18-page memorandum in great details shows the obstructionist activities of the State Department and of people in Congress. To the rescue of Jews. And certainly the immigration of Jews into this country. And of course, it also, this memorandum went into Long's testimony before the Senate or House Foreign Relations Committee, in which he just lied about everything. For example, he said that 560,000 Jews and persecutees had been admitted. Our entire immigration quota for the entire world was 580,000 at the time. And the memorandum pointed out other lies. It was signed by Randolph Paul, submitted to Secretary Morgenthau, and its basis, President Roosevelt signed the executive order setting up the War Refugee Board.
We'll now pause for a change in tapes. This is tape number 6 in the interview with Mrs. Belzec. You told us in the last tape about your involvement peripherally, if it's correct to say so, in the establishment of the War Refugee Board. You also, I think, mentioned before that there was another item you wanted to allude to in the aim of rescuing survivors in Europe.
Well, this concerns the displaced persons in various DP camps throughout Germany. And my first introduction to the camps was through a colleague, Joe Stone of Washington, a lawyer who died a couple years ago, shortly after our last reunion. And he said it was very important for me to come to the camps, that these people were just so happy to meet people connected with the trials, and particularly Americans, and even more particularly Jews. And I went with him, and Joe, of course, spoke fluent Jewish, but I was so struck by their lack of decent clothing and decent food, and particularly the one thing all of them asked for was aspirin. And there weren't toothbrushes and as much soap. There was plenty of soap, but it wasn't very nice soap, and things like that. So that I alerted my sister, and she really set up a web of women from the National Council of Jewish Women and many other organizations, and non-Jewish friends of hers and their churches. And she began sending boxes over to Joe, and to me and to Joe. And in fact, when he came home from Nuremberg, she was one of the first people he went to visit, and he and she became very close friends, much closer than Joe and I were in Nuremberg. But so that I was doing this in conjunction with Joe. He would get packages, I would. Sometimes we'd go together. And they just, liked just our presence. And of course, I think I said Joe spoke Yiddish, a very important language to have then and today. And subsequently, Peter Bergson appeared on the scene. This had nothing to do with our local relief, very limited relief effort in Nuremberg. But he appeared at Nuremberg, and he, of course, had been connected with Ergun, and he was just so helpful to the War Refugee Board. He had ideas. You see, many of the Jewish people and organizations were so dispirited by the Bermuda Conference in early 1943, the Conference on Refugees, which ended up doing absolutely nothing. The British refused to take people, Jews, and the United States did. And the Jews were organizations, and people like Stephen Wise were dispirited, no question, but they continued to help. One of the many authors on everything connected with Nuremberg and the rescue of the Jews, but one of the many authors says that this attitude encouraged Hitler, that this was the reason that Hitler pursued his massacre of the Jews up to the final solution and through it. But Bergson appeared, and he happened to know, and Bergson was not discouraged by the Bermuda Conference at all. He was publicizing everything he could find about what was happening to the Jews, what progress the War Refugee Board made, what difficulties it met with. He was all over Congress and all over the executive branches, departments. But he knew somehow that I knew people in the transportation division of the Office of Military Government. And he needed exit permits for people and visas to Brazil. And I helped him, I helped him obtain these. And then the day that this train, that the transportation people were to supply this train in Munich, their point of departure for wherever they were going, I figured that nobody had thought to put any food on the train. And that bothered me. And some reason I fastened on coffee and donuts. Donuts, for me then, was a panacea for everything. And I went to Munich, and where would I go? I went to the office of the Joint Distribution Committee, or the Jewish Agency. I forget which it was. And they were pretty hostile. Well, they weren't hostile to me or to the idea of food, but they wanted to know under whose auspices that train was leaving. And there was this internecine warfare going on, which people have said it's exaggerated, it didn't exist. Well, it really did exist. But Bergson was one of the most remarkable people I have ever been privileged to know. And so was Sam Merlin, of course. Sam became very respectable. He became a member of the Knesset. And then he came to this country and he taught at one of our universities, I forget which, and then there was Ari Jabotinsky, who put his head on the line, bribing customs peoples on borders, and ended up in a Turkish jail. Now you've heard a lot, excuse me, but while I'm on that subject, you've heard a lot about Ira Hirschman in Turkey. Pardon me. He wrote, at that time, one of the few thousand books, the thousands of books, not few, that have been written about the Holocaust and about Nuremberg. But actually, it was Ari who was a genuine hero. And he died very young. He was just submitted to terrible indignities and brutalities in jail.
Now, what specifically did you do in respect to these names that you've mentioned as people who are working very hard for the survivors?
Oh, I didn't do anything for them other than for Peter in Nuremberg, who engineered this exodus from Munich.
I see. Was that one or many trains that were going out?
It was the only one I know of that I was involved in. Mm-hmm. There were other trains in France and elsewhere in Europe.
If we can come back for a moment with the original point that you made about your sister getting the boxes of food and so forth, did you personally deliver those boxes of food to the camp, to the people there?
Some of them, yes, many of them.
And
until a friend of mine came over who was a top-notch secretary, a close friend from here in Suffern. And incidentally, I got her over there to do secretarial work for me, and Benny Ferenz appropriated her for the Einsatzgruppen case. But my sister one time sent a huge box, and as was very typical of her, on top of the clothing and the aspirin or whatever she was sending, she put a bunch of colored hair ribbons. And I had the most touching experience I've ever had in those camps, because it became apparent to me that these little girls did not know colors. They had never heard the word rot for red, or blue, blau for blue, or vice, or any of them. Maybe, no, they hadn't heard of vice. The only word they knew was Schwarz, black. And I never could tell that story really without crying, because to me it was so appalling, you know? And it was such a nice touch of my sister's. But they needed medical and psychiatric care a lot more than they needed hair ribbons. But they were just delighted with them.
When you returned home and you said you were continuing to work in the Treasury Department, how long did you keep that job there?
About a year, slightly over a year.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned Bill several times in your testimony. When did the two of you get married?
1949.
And where?
4 years after we met, it was, in May of 49.
Mm-hmm. And where did you live after getting married?
We lived at 128 Central Park, South in Manhattan. Wonderful apartment house.
And when and where were your children born?
There, in Manhattan.
And how many do you have?
2.
And what are their names?
The older girl is Deborah, and our son is John, who was 10 plus months younger than Deborah. So, and after John was born, we came directly from the hospital here to the house, which was being built at the time. Bill had moved us from Manhattan.
In raising your children, did you ever speak to them very much about the Shoah?
When you say much, no. But they are very aware of the Holocaust. They have watched so many documentaries, and they've seen so many documentaries in this house. And of course, they were both very much involved with the movie Judgment at Nuremberg with Spencer Tracy, and which I thought was one of the greatest, most amazing scripts I have ever read, that Abby Mann wrote. And he took so much of it from the various trials, and he patterned his actors upon people who were actually at Nuremberg, and then he put it together in a trial that never took place.
How did the experience that you had, your experience in touching the rims of the Holocaust, if you will, did that affect the way you raised your children in any way?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Although I must say that they both have a fair interest in social justice, maybe not more than any of their peers, but certainly they are on the side of the angels, you know, where humanitarianism is concerned.
Would you regard the experience that you had in the I.G. Farben trial as a defining moment in your life?
Well, for many years, I maintained the proposition that there were certain experiences that one was better off not to have had. Bill felt that this was the greatest chapter in everybody's life, everybody who had been at the trials. And just what you call a defining experience. But I just felt that it was a very searing experience. For years, well, to this day, if I get a certain smell in my nostrils, it evokes many unpleasant memories, and I usually get sick to my stomach in a tenement house or in some places in Harlem, and that, of course, is my pathology. And I don't think it's common. Today, I feel that it was really a tremendous experience. Where would anybody like me get that kind of experience? And today, when I read particularly Taylor's opening and closing statements, Justice Jackson was known for his eloquence, and his opening at the IMT is now practically Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg. You see it everywhere. You know the famous speech of the greatest, I'm not going to try to paraphrase it because it would not do it justice. Telford was a tremendously eloquent person, just as eloquent, I think, as Jackson. And his opening in the Flick case, for example, which preceded the I.G. Farben case, explained exactly. It starts, these are wealthy men, but that is not their sin. We do not punish them because they were successful businessmen. And then he goes on, and as I say, I don't want to paraphrase him, but I'll tell you that in addition to this history I was talking about, it's great literature.
Do you speak or write often about the Holocaust and or about the trial?
No.
How do you feel about the Germans today?
I feel much more kindly disposed to them. I think they have made, well, of course, now I'm not talking about the present regime. I know absolutely nothing about this new prime minister of theirs or what he's about or where he came from. But I must say that Adenauer and Kohl and people like him have really broken their backs where restitution and indemnification is concerned. And that's the Jewish thing. And they have taken refugees. I mean, people from all over the world, and particularly Bosnia, when there was so much trouble there. And, oh, sure, they've got this lunatic fringe there, which is being aped by our own fanatics and crazies. They've got these groups of would-be Nazis and stormtroopers, which are very scary, but I just think that the government should be congratulated on keeping them under pretty tight wraps. I think a lot tighter than we keep our people, our gangs like this. But I hated the Germans when I went over to Nuremberg, and then another thing was that I hated the Americans because I felt they were carpetbaggers, all except the lawyers. The lawyers may have been young and inexperienced, but they were all dedicated. And they weren't going around buying china, mice in China and other kinds of china which had the blood of Jews on it. And one lawyer in Paris made some fortunate art deals, but he's really the only one I know of who did. But the rest of them were trafficking in currency. And I mean, we had kids who I don't believe went to school beyond the 8th grade, who were the most skilled arbitrageurs in America, you know. They'd be taking running currency through Switzerland. And And incidentally, some of them were buying shares in IG Farben, which were then worth about 35 cents. And now they're really worth something, these shares. IG Farben is still in existence.
Now, before we conclude our interview, is there anything that we have left out or that you would like to add to what we've discussed today?
I can't think of anything except that that I am really discouraged by the apathy that I sense where the United Nations is concerned and the establishment of a permanent international criminal court. As I say, everybody prattles about peace. I think it's that word must be mentioned millions of times every day, not just in the churches every time somebody has a drink, but nobody does anything to promote the cause of peace or to stand up for the United Nations, which admittedly is a very troublesome vehicle for accomplishing anything. So was NATO. But if the purpose of it was not to create the machinery for peace, I don't know why we have a United Nations at all. It should be a lot more than an employment agency, certainly, for unemployed people from all over the world. It's our only hope. And it may be our last hope, considering nuclear proliferation and all the rest of it. So that I really wish that more people, more churches, more organizations were working for a global peace as well as for a global economy, which they have been very successful at. And that's about all.
One last question. You spoke before about the idealism that you and the other young lawyers had in your engagement at the trial. 50 years later today, how much of that idealism do you retain? How much has been supplanted in your mind by, let's say, reality? In other words, how do you feel in your own mind and consciousness about what the future will bring?
Well, I may be discouraged, but I am still idealistic, not compared to colleagues like Whitney Harris and Ben Ferencz and the people I've mentioned to you, because with them it's a full-time occupation and preoccupation. And they are really wonderful people. So even to put myself in the same class, but certainly I would do anything I could. And I'm going to do much more in the way of closing the door and writing. Of writing and giving them any help they need in publicizing the cause.
This concludes the interview with Mrs. Belzec. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
This is tape 7 in the interview with Mrs. Belzec.
This is I at in court on the I.G. Farben trial. At that time, of course, I was known as Belle Mayer. And to my right is John Sharmatz, who was a lawyer from Czechoslovakia and an enormous help to everybody on the prosecution staff. This is I in the documents room, the I.G. Farben documents room at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. This is the indictment in the I.G. Farben case, which ran over 100 pages. Attached to it is the appendix that Bill was describing, which was over 40 pages, which described in detail each defendant, his positions in I.G. Farben, and the various positions he held in the government departments and agencies throughout the 1930s and till the war was over. This is the report signed by Randolph Paul, submitted to the Secretary Morgenthau of the Treasury in December of 1944, titled The Acquiescence of Our Government in the Murder of the Jews. This is part 10, which contains the exhibits to the Bernstein report and the Bernstein testimony before the Senate committee investigating the our wartime production and the elimination of Germany's resources for war. This document, I might tell you, contains, for many, many pages of fine print, the new order, which I.G. Farben started preparing as early as 1936, which was submitted to the government in, I think, 39 or 1940, which had a blueprint for I.G. Farben's taking over the chemical industries of all the countries which were annexed or subjugated by the Nazis. For example, it shows what their capacity is in minute detail. Marginal factories were to be, the marginal factories which were to be closed, the ones that I.G. Farben felt had great potential, and their plans for the future. For example, Skoda Wetzlar Works in Austria, which they took over as the Wehrmacht walked into Austria. They even go so far as to set forth their plans for Imperial Chemical Industries of England, and then they turn their attention to DuPont in the United States. This is a letter from Bernard Bernstein, Office of Military Government in Germany, dated December 1945, in which he acknowledges my work on the various reports that were submitted to the Kilgore Committee, and in which he thanks me, and he goes into some detail about that. The only important thing is the heading, which shows his position as director of the Finance Division and so on. This is a letter from General Taylor, Office of Chief Counsel for War Crimes, dated August 2, 1948, in which he says, "Dear Belle, upon the conclusion of the Farben trial, I want to send you my deepest thanks for all the good advice and help you gave me in setting up the Farben trial team and for your magnificent contribution to the preparation and presentation of the case. I suppose that, when you read the judgment, many of its features will surprise and disappoint you as much as they did all of us here. But regardless of how the judgment may be evaluated in years to come, I'm sure that the record which you and Joe and the others made will be generally regarded as a great step in the development of international penal law. With all good wishes," etc. This is a letter dated in May of 1996 from Eli Rosenbaum, who was the head of the Office of Special Investigations in the Criminal Justice Division of the United States Department of Justice, and in which he thanks me for agreeing to come and talk to the lawyers in his division. And it says he's inviting other interns, and he talks a little bit about me. What's interesting about the letter is, I think that yesterday he went to Kosovo with some FBI people, and I think with people from, obviously, with people from his division, to help the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague in the gathering of evidence. From left to right, top row, these are our grandchildren. At the top left is Jessica Thorne, our oldest grandchild, and to the right of her is Daniel Zek, who is 6 months younger than Jessica. And she is a great brain, he is a great athlete. On the bottom row, from right to left, is Benjamin Zek, very poor picture of him, who is a great athlete, good at school, and very handsome. And the youngster to the left of Ben is Andrew Thorne, who is just the apple of our eyes.